Imagine living in a world where rats weren't just an annoying problem, they were a life-or-death threat. In the Middle Ages, rats and mice were absolutely everywhere. They raided food stores, spread deadly diseases, and turned daily survival into an even bigger nightmare for medieval peasants. But here's the crazy part. Those peasants didn't just sit around and let rodents take over. Nope. They fought back, with surprising creativity, some seriously weird methods, and just a touch of medieval madness. Today we're diving into 15 of the easiest, strangest, and sometimes grossest ways medieval peasants managed to keep rats and mice at bay. From fierce feline warriors and tube-shaped assassins to homemade rat sprays and hairy scare tactics, the fight against rats was as bizarre as it was relentless. How did medieval folks train animals to be pest control experts? What DIY methods nearly killed more people than the rats themselves? What absolutely disgusting tricks actually worked? And just how desperate did things get when all else failed? Stick around, because medieval rat warfare wasn't just serious business. It was a full-on arms race against one of history's sneakiest enemies. And trust me, some of their solutions will leave you either laughing or gagging. When it came to dealing with rats, medieval peasants knew that the first and best line of defense wasn't poison or traps. It was a killer with 4 legs, sharp claws, and zero patience for rodents. Cats weren't just cute companions lounging by the fire. In the Middle Ages, they were full-blown security systems. And a good mouser could mean the difference between surviving the winter or starving through it. Not just any cat would do, though. Peasants looked for certain traits that signaled a top-tier rodent hunter: stocky build, quick reflexes, short tails for better balance, and the infamous hunter's eye, a laser-sharp stare that said, "I will destroy every mouse in this room." Scruffy, street-smart cats were preferred over pampered noble pets, which were often more concerned with preening than pouncing. In fact, a truly skilled mouser could become a medieval celebrity. Some towns kept records of exceptional cats, rewarding their owners with tax breaks, free ale, or even prized food rations. One legendary cat reportedly caught over 50 rats in a single month, basically becoming the medieval version of an MVP. Some villages even held local contests to crown the top cat. Imagine a medieval talent show. But instead of singing, it was all about savage mouse takedowns. Testing kittens for future greatness was serious business. Families would dangle scraps of cloth or toss pebbles to see which kittens pounced first. The slow ones, "Sorry, little guy, you're out." In a world where food was precious, a lazy cat wasn't a pet. It was an expensive mistake nobody could afford. Cats that proved themselves weren't just praised, they were protected like treasure. Peasants would sometimes lock their best mouses indoors at night, fearing theft. Yes, stealing someone's prized cat could actually land you in legal trouble. Medieval court records even show fines for catnappers. Imagine standing in front of a judge trying to explain that you only borrowed the village's top rat killer. Cats earned treats and scraps for every successful hunt, and smart peasants even encouraged the behavior by releasing captured mice for cats to practice on. It was medieval positive reinforcement training, long before TikTok tutorials made it trendy. Some wealthier families even designed cozy nests specifically for their best cats, complete with straw bedding and easy access to granaries, because nothing says employee benefits like prime mouse hunting real estate. But while cats were highly effective, there was one tiny problem. Cats hunt on their own terms. If a cat wasn't in the mood, no amount of rat infestations could get it off its nap schedule. That's why some peasants sought backup plans, because when rats outnumbered humans and your star mouser decided it was bath day, you needed a plan B, and fast. When the rats were too quick, too sneaky, or too deeply hidden for even the best cats to catch, medieval peasants turned to a secret weapon most modern people wouldn't expect: ferrets. These long, flexible little hunters weren't just adorable, they were absolute nightmares for rodents. Think of them as the Middle Ages version of high-tech snake cameras, except way more aggressive and with more tiny teeth. Ferrets were prized for one reason: they could go where cats and people couldn't. Their narrow bodies let them slip into rat holes, crawl behind walls, and chase down pests through winding underground tunnels. Once a ferret caught the scent, Of a rat, it was game over. Rats would either be dragged back out squealing or chased into traps waiting at the exits. But training a ferret wasn't as easy as tossing it into a hole and hoping for the best. Young ferrets had to be carefully taught to return to their handlers after a hunt. Losing your ferret inside a wall was like losing your car keys, except this set could bite. To keep track of them, peasants often tied tiny bells or scraps of cloth to their ferrets so they could hear or spot them in dark, cramped spaces. A well-trained ferret could clear an entire granary in just a few hours, saving precious food supplies from ruin. And because rats absolutely panicked when they caught a whiff of a ferret, even the smell alone could flush dozens of rodents out into the open. Medieval pest control at its finest. Ferrets were so valuable that some wealthier peasants and towns kept special ferret trainers on hand, sort of like having a medieval exterminator on call. Training a good hunting ferret could take months, but once ready, a single ferret could earn its weight in grain, cheese, and beer. Of course, ferrets had their downsides. They were notoriously stubborn and occasionally decided that chasing rats was optional. Plus, if they got loose without supervision, they could cause just as much havoc as the rats they were supposed to catch. A rogue ferret tearing through your food storage wasn't exactly the happy ending peasants hoped for. Still, for medieval folks serious about winning the rat war, ferrets were the ultimate stealth weapon, small, silent, relentless, and just a little bit chaotic. Before chemical sprays and store-bought rat traps, medieval peasants turned to something a little more natural. Turns out the original pest control aisle wasn't in a medieval market, it was in the herb garden. With rats sneaking into food stores and spreading disease, peasants discovered that strong smells could do what swords and traps sometimes couldn't: drive rodents away. The all-star in the medieval herbal toolkit was mint. Peasants would crush fresh mint leaves and scatter them around doorways, windows, and food storage areas. To rats, that refreshing menthol smell wasn't a nice pick-me-up. It was basically a giant do not enter sign. If your house smelled like a medieval toothpaste factory, you were doing it right. Right behind mint was garlic. Crushed cloves, garlic-infused rags, and even garlic juice spread around homes worked like natural rat kryptonite. Rats hated the strong sulfur compound so much that some farmers joked garlic didn't just keep away rats, it kept away nosy neighbors too. Wormwood was another medieval favorite, known for its intensely bitter smell and later for its starring a role in absinthe. Wormwood was scattered in homes, grain stores, and barns. Sure, it smelled a bit like someone burned a pharmacy, but it kept the furry freeloaders away, and that was what mattered. But why stop at single herbs when you could? Go full medieval mad scientist? Some peasants mixed mint, garlic, wormwood, and mustard seed powder into powerful rat-repelling blends. One 15th century recipe even added vinegar to the mix, creating a smell so strong it probably scared off rats, humans, and any unfortunate guests who dropped by unannounced. Mustard seed itself was a key player too, ground into powder and sprinkled. Across thresholds, the spicy, pungent scent was unbearable for rats' ultra-sensitive noses. Walking through a medieval hot sauce minefield wasn't worth the reward of stealing a few grains of wheat. These herbal methods had a lot going. For them, they were cheap, easy to make, and safe for families and livestock. Plus, in a time when plumbing didn't exist and everyone could use a little air freshening, doubling up on rat control and deodorizer was a medieval win-win. Sure, herbal defenses weren't foolproof. Hungry rats could tough it out when desperate, but for most peasants, a well-scented home was the first line of defense in the eternal battle against the rodent hordes. When strong smells and stealthy cats weren't enough, medieval peasants turned to something a little more extreme, and a lot more dangerous: homemade rat poison. Forget science labs and safety warnings. In the Middle Ages, rat poison was basically mix whatever deadly stuff you can find and hope it kills the rats before it kills you. Arsenic was the medieval rock star of poisons. Peasants who lived near mineral deposits could scrape up white arsenic powder and mix it into food baits like cheese fat or breadcrumbs. A rat would take a nibble and ideally never nibble again. Never nibble again. But arsenic wasn't exactly a precision weapon. It could and did kill pets, kids, and sometimes unlucky adults who didn't realize last night's leftovers were spiked with DIY death. When arsenic wasn't available, peasants got creative and, even scarier, hemlock, famously the plant that killed Socrates, became a go-to ingredient. Ground hemlock mixed with honey created irresistible rat baits. One medieval manuscript included a cheery warning, "Keep from hands of children, beasts, and foolish men." Translation, "This stuff is instant regret, and if poisons weren't deadly enough on their own, some medieval folks added a little extra." Medieval madness. Ground glass. Yes, tiny shards of glass were mixed into food left out for rats. The theory was simple and horrifying. Rats would eat the bait, the glass would shred their insides, and voila, problem solved. Modern science says this idea probably didn't work very well, but it definitely shows how desperate people were. Poison recipes were usually passed down orally or scribbled in the margins of household guides. There were no clear labels, no use with caution stickers, just a lot of trial and deadly error. Unsurprisingly, accidents were common. Historical. Records tell of entire families falling ill after rats dragged poisoned food into human storage areas. One town in England banned arsenic-based rat bait after 3 children died in a single month. Even so, with food so precious and rats threatening survival, many peasants kept brewing their own toxic rat cocktails in secret. After all, a few. Accidental poisoning seemed like a small price compared to losing your winter grain supply to an army of hungry rodents. In medieval pest control, if you weren't willing to get a little reckless, you probably weren't winning. When poison proved too risky and cats and ferrets couldn't catch every rat, medieval peasants got clever with physics. And a shovel. Enter the pit trap, the ultimate low-cost, low-tech rat-catching machine. Simple to make, safe for the household, and oddly satisfying, pit traps turned peasant homes into tiny rodent prisons. The idea was brilliantly straightforward. Find a spot where rats like to travel, grain stores, kitchen corners, or along barn walls, then dig a small hole about 6 to 8 inches deep. Disguise the opening with a thin layer of straw or cloth dusted with dirt, and wait for gravity to do its thing. Rats, ever the busy little foragers, would scurry right over the trap, fall in and find themselves stuck. But medieval peasants didn't stop at just a hole. The inside of the pit was often lined with clay or smeared with animal fat to make. The walls too slick for tiny rat claws to climb. Watching a rat helplessly scrabble at greasy clay must have been the Middle Ages version of binge-worthy entertainment. Pit traps weren't just effective, they were reusable. Once a pit was full of panicked rats, peasants would dispatch the unlucky prisoners with clubs, dogs, or simply dump them into the woods to become someone else's problem. Resetting the trap was as easy as cleaning it out and recamouflaging the top. Medieval kids often got assigned the task of checking and emptying pit traps each morning. Imagine being a 10-year-old whose chores included, go count how many rats fell into the death hole last night. Not exactly fetching water for mom, but definitely high on the excitement list. Some clever inventors added mechanical twists, balancing a thin stick over the pit with bait at the center. When a rat tried to cross the stick to reach the prize, its weight would tip the stick and the rat straight into the pit below. Bonus. Points if the rat tried it in front of an audience. Pit traps also had the advantage of being much safer than homemade poisons. No risk of accidentally poisoning your family or your livestock, and for peasants living hand-to-mouth, safer solutions meant fewer tragedies. In the endless medieval war against rats, sometimes the best strategy was the simplest. Dig a hole, bait the enemy, and let nature and gravity handle the rest. Modern pest control companies might brag about ultrasonic devices, but medieval peasants were already ahead of the game, just without the fancy tech. When rats grew too bold and traps weren't enough, medieval folks tried something wild, scaring rats away with sound. At first glance, it sounds a little ridiculous. Make enough noise and rats will just leave? Surprisingly, medieval peasants had some decent logic behind it. They noticed that rats fled during noisy events like village festivals or metalworking sessions. Loud, unpredictable sounds made rats uneasy, and humans decided to weaponize that fear. The simplest method? Clanging metal noisemakers. Peasants would hang thin sheets of copper or iron from strings in barns and homes. Whenever the wind blew or someone walked by, the sheets clattered together like a mini medieval drumline. To rats, it was chaos. To peasants, it was music, sweet rat-free music. But the real innovation came with rat whistles, tiny instruments carved from hollow reeds or bird bones. When blown, these whistles emitted high-pitched sounds that were almost inaudible to humans, but drove rats absolutely nuts. Some villages even employed professional rat pipers who made weekly rounds through storage areas, whistling their way into history. Forget the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Medieval Europe had entire squads of noisy rat fighters. Peasant kids were often recruited as the noisemakers-in-chief. Given sticks, pots, or just a good pair of stomping boots, kids would parade around barns and food stores, banging and shouting to keep rats from getting too comfortable. Somewhere in medieval parenting manuals, this probably counted as both pest control and after-school exercise. Did it actually work? Modern science suggests that loud, unpredictable noise does stress rats out, and while it wouldn't wipe out a rat colony, it could convince some of the more nervous ones to move along. Plus, it was a method with zero risk of poisoning yourself or setting your house on fire, which was always a win in the Middle Ages. The downside? Medieval villages weren't exactly known for peace and quiet. If your neighbors were serious about sound-based rat defense, you could expect random pot-banging symphonies at all hours. But hey, at least it wasn't rats chewing through your grain stores. In the medieval rat wars, sometimes it wasn't about fighting smarter or harder, it was about fighting louder. When real hunters weren't enough, medieval peasants got crafty, literally. If a live cat or a trained ferret wasn't available, they made fake predators to fool the rats. Think scarecrows. But for rats, and with a medieval DIY vibe that was part brilliant, part ridiculous. One of the most popular creations was the wooden owl. Carved from a block of wood and sometimes decorated with real feathers, these owls were perched near food stores and granaries. Rats, who naturally feared aerial predators, would often hesitate, or at least rethink, running into a space where a giant owl seemed to be waiting. Sure, to a human, the wooden owl might have looked more like a weird art project than a terrifying bird of prey, but to a rat with half a brain, it was enough to give them second thoughts. Some peasants didn't stop at owls. They carved snakes, out of clay or wood, painting them with local snake patterns for extra realism. These were strategically hidden under piles of straw or near rat holes where a rodent might stumble upon one and bolt the other way. If you couldn't afford a real snake, a decoy would do in a pinch. However, rats are clever little creatures. Over time, they learned which predators were fake. A rat might freeze the first time it saw a suspicious owl shape, but by the fifth day of nothing happening, it was back to stealing grain like a furry little outlaw. To stay ahead, peasants had to get creative, moving the decoys around regularly to keep the illusion alive. Rotating your wooden army was basically medieval rat psychology at work. Some particularly crafty peasants even built moving decoys. 1. Manuscript describes a pivoting wooden hawk that would sway back and forth when the wind blew. Imagine a rat approaching a granary, seeing the bird move slightly, and deciding, you know what? I'm out of here. Of course, even the best fakes had their flaws. Over time, rats sometimes grew so bold they nested beside the fake predators, or worse, chewed them up for nesting material. Nothing says epic failure quite like finding your carefully carved owl missing half its face because rats turned it into bedding. Still, fake predators bought valuable time and peace of mind, proving once again that medieval peasants weren't just survivors. They were sneaky, resourceful, and just a little bit savage. When cats, ferrets, herbs, and fake predators weren't enough, medieval peasants dug deep into their survival instincts and their own bodies. In the ultimate use what you've got move, they turned human byproducts into powerful rat repellents. Gross? Absolutely. Absolutely. Effective? Surprisingly. Yes. First up, human hair. Peasants didn't waste anything back then, and that included the stuff that fell off their heads. After combing or cutting hair, families would gather the strands and stuff them into little cloth pouches. These were then tucked into corners, storage areas, and near suspected rat holes. The human scent trapped in the hair acted like a warning signal to rats, reminding them that bigger, scarier predators lived nearby. But why stop at hair when you could get even nastier? Urine, yes, actual pee, became a go-to rat repellent. Chamber pots weren't just for nightly emergencies. Some were strategically emptied around homes to create invisible rat-repelling barriers. Strong human scent, especially from males, according to medieval experts, was thought to scare rats away. Some texts even suggested eating garlic-heavy meals before marking territory to make the smell extra unbearable. Medieval life was not glamorous. Sweat-soaked clothing also got a second life in pest control. After a long day's work in the fields, peasants would hang their sweaty shirts or tunics near food stores. The combination of human body odor and old fabric funk was apparently enough to convince some rats that maybe the next barn over was a better idea. Even fingernail clippings were thrown into the anti-rat arsenal. Scattered along windowsills, door frames, and pantry shelves, they acted as tiny scent bombs. Rats are sensitive to predator smells and the lingering human scent. Even from something as small as a nail clipping might have been enough to trigger their danger instincts. Of course, none of these methods were foolproof. Hungry rats are brave rats, and during harsh winters or famine seasons, even the strongest smells couldn't always keep them away. But for everyday defense, especially in less desperate times, these gross homemade repellents provided a low-cost, low-effort way to defend precious food supplies. In the never-ending rat wars of the Middle Ages, medieval peasants proved that when survival was on the line, pride and personal hygiene were negotiable. At some point, medieval peasants realized that constantly fighting rats wasn't enough. They had to outsmart them. Instead of only chasing rats away, they worked to stop them from reaching food in the first place. And honestly, some of their storage hacks were pure genius. The simplest method? Hang the food out of reach. Grain, dried meat, and precious stores of flour were packed into cloth sacks and suspended from ceiling beams with strong ropes. High above the ground, out of jumping range, food hung like medieval piñatas, but without the candy payoff for any rodents lurking below. Peasants didn't just hang food, they booby-trapped the ropes too. They fitted them with wide wooden or metal discs called rat guards. When a rat tried to climb the rope, it would hit the slippery, spinning disc and either fall off or give up. It was like a medieval version of those anti-squirrel bird feeder shields, except the stakes were survival, not backyard bragging rights. For foods that needed to be kept dry and safe, sealed clay pots were a staple. Peasants would use beeswax or pitch to seal the lids, creating an airtight, rat-proof container. In wealthier homes, large wooden chests served the same purpose, sometimes even reinforced with metal strips to make gnawing impossible. Another clever invention, elevated food platforms. Built several feet off the ground, these wooden platforms rested on poles, topped with wide, greasy discs rats couldn't climb over. Grain bins stood like little castles on stilts, forcing any hungry rat to reconsider its life choices. Some particularly determined peasants took it even further, using greased poles. A smooth wooden pole was slathered with animal fat, and food was placed on a platform at the top. Rats might be excellent climbers, but try scaling a medieval slip and slide, covered in bacon grease. Not happening. Records from medieval manors and monasteries show just how effective these storage solutions were. One monastery noted that after switching to suspended storage, rat-related grain losses dropped by more than 75%. In a world where every handful of food could mean the difference between life and death, these simple innovations weren't just smart, they were life-saving. In the end, the peasants who protected their food best didn't rely only on traps or poison. They relied on outthinking the enemy, and in the medieval rat war, brains beat brawn every time. After all the traps, poisons, fake predators, and sweaty shirts, sometimes medieval peasants still lost the war against rats. And when times got truly desperate, especially during famines, there was only one option left: turn the rats into dinner. Historical records show that during the harshest years, when crops failed and grain stores ran dry, rats were no longer just pests. They became protein. Families would trap, skin, and stew rats alongside whatever scraps of vegetables and herbs they had left. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't appetizing, But when your choices were eat rat or starve, medieval folks learned to get creative with seasoning. Rat meat was even sold at markets during extreme famines, sometimes at prices higher than chicken. Medical texts of the time grudgingly admitted that rat meat had nutritive qualities, although they strongly recommended thorough cooking, because the last thing you needed was a side of disease with your medieval rat stew. In the grand story of peasants versus rodents, one thing is clear. Medieval people didn't just survive, they adapted. Rats brought sickness, famine, and ruin, but peasants fought back with cleverness, toughness, and a little bit of very questionable cooking. If you enjoyed learning about these wild, weird rat-fighting tactics, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment about which method you found the craziest.